The institution known as lething, Leidang, ledung, expeditio, sometimes lething, was a form of conscription to organize coastal fleets for seasonal excursions and in defense of the realm, typical for medieval Scandinavians, and, later, a public levy of free farmers. In Anglo-Saxon England, a different system was used to achieve similar ends, and was known as the Fyrd origins. The Leidang of Norway is first mentioned AD 985 by skaldic courtly poets of Jarl Håkon of Western Norway and his son Eric. In each poem, the princes are praised for summoning the ships of the Leidang to the Battle of Hjormungavær against a Danish fleet. Later on, the King of Norway, Harald Hardrad, is praised by two court skalds for summoning the Leidang to attack Denmark. Harald is also called King of the Leidang, and the latter is termed Almenning, the duty and right of all men. During the 11th century, Danish naval forces, though not termed Leidang, were sporadically praised as led by Danish kings. May 21, 1085, a Danish royal charter stipulates that certain people on the lands of the canons of Lund are liable to pay fines for neglecting expeditio. A serious discussion concerning the source-critical value of skaldic poetry is ongoing between Niels Lund and Rick Malmrose. The lething was established in the medieval era, and not the Viking Age. It has been considered the maritime version of the Germanic system of hundreds, which was described as early as 98 AD by Tacitus as the centenary. Since Tacitus also said the Swedes had a powerful fleet, it might have been based on the Leidang. However, since all our sources on the Leidang are medieval, this is highly uncertain. Before the establishment of the Leidang, the defense of the realm was probably based on voluntary contribution to a defense fleet. With the rise of the monarchies, the contribution became a duty structure. The lething was a system organizing a coastal fleet with the aim of defense, coerced trade, plunderings, and aggressive wars. Normally, the fleet levy was on expeditions for 2 or 3 summer months. All free men were obliged to take part in and contribute to the lething. All of the lething was called to arms when invading forces threatened the land. In the expeditions, only a fraction of the ships were taking part, but as expeditions often were profitable, many magnates and chieftains tried to join with the people as often as possible. The Leidang divided the land into districts, skipskrers or ship communities, skipritha, skipen, skepslag or rosslag, skipride or skibride, and required every skipride to deliver 1 ship and crew. These skipride were administrative areas in which residents were assigned to outfit a ship for military use. They were collectively responsible to build, maintain, equip and staff a Leidang skip, fully provisioned for 2 or 3 months. Skipride were mainly on the coast, but also extended quite far inland along fjords and deep waterways, to safeguard the procurement of timber for building of the warships. If enemy forces attacked the country, fires built on high hills would mobilize the farmers to the skipride. The number of farms in an area determined the size of a skipride. It did not usually include the entire parish, nor was it confined to a parish. It could include farms from several parishes. The farmers of each district had to build and equip a road-sailing ship. The size of the ships was defined as a standardized number of oars, initially 40 oars, later 24 oars. In Norway, there were 279 such districts in 1277, in Denmark 2-3 times as many. The head of a district was called styrmath or steersman, and he functioned as captain of the ship. The smallest unit was the crew of peasants who had to arm and provide for 1 oarsman. In Sweden, a hamna was made up of 2 attung, which was 2/8 parts of a village. 1 attung seems to have been equal to the land area it took to feed an ordinary family. Vergate and Oxgang, 4 English English equivalents. Each atung also regarded as having a share in the raid, so one who owned 2 atung had twice as much chance to go on the raid as one who owned only 1. Those who owned less than an atung had to team up with others to form a unit of 1 atung and share the burdens as well as the profit. According to the law of Upperland, the hundreds of Upperland provided as many as 4 ships each, those of vast manland 2 ships and those of Roslagen 1 ship. The older laws regulating the lethang require every man to, as a minimum, arm himself with an axe or a sword in addition to spear and shield, and for every row bench to have a bow and 24 arrows. Later 12th–13th century changes to this law code list more extensive equipment for the more affluent freemen, with helmet, mail hauberk, shield, spear and sword being what the well-to-do farmer a burgher must bring to war. In 12th–13th century sources detailing the 11th century, jarls are mentioned as the chieftain of the lethang. In the 12th century, a bishop could also be head of the fleet levy, although typically nobles led levies in the 12th to 14th centuries. Equipment. At the start of its origins in the early Dark Ages, the majority of the leidang would have been unarmored. Some of the wealthier men may have worn leather and iron-spangled helms, while the wealthiest would wear mail or possibly leather armor. As the Viking Age began, the leidang slowly began to improve in terms of armor as their areas became richer. By the 9th century, most members of a leidang would have had helmets of iron or leather construction, either of the spangen helm and nasal helm design. Drangs would have worn mail, while wealthier freemen may have worn leather or padded cloth. Spears were common to all men, and many would have had short hand axes. Nobles and wealthy freemen would have had swords. Shields were used by all, and were usually round and of wooden leather construction, sometimes with leather or wine binding around the rim. By the 12th century, helmets and padded gambesons were very common, the cattle hat type of helmet now being used alongside the earlier nasal helm and spangen helm types. Padded armor and mail were also more common among ordinary men. Evolution. In parts of the Scandinavian countries, the lethang evolved to a tax in the 12th century to 13th century, paid by all farmers until the 19th century, although the ship levy was frequently called out and used in the 13th, 15th centuries, with the Norwegian lethang fleet going as far as Scotland in the 1260s. The use of the levy tax as opposed to the use of maritime forces was more prevalent in Denmark and Sweden than Norway, since the Norwegian kingdom always depended heavily on fleet-based forces rather than land-based ones. Skippride, originally a defense system, later assumed other powers, such as legal authority to pass laws and financial authority to levy taxes. Towards the end of the 13th century, they only existed for these purposes. In about 1660, skippride were converted into tinglags, court districts that included a bygdeting or a biting. England. In Anglo-Saxon times, defences were based on the Fyrd. It was a militia called up from the districts threatened with attack. Service in the Fyrd was usually of short duration and participants were expected to provide their own arms and provisions. The origins of the Fyrd can be traced back to at least the 7th century, and it is likely that the obligation of Englishmen to serve in the Fyrd dates from before its earliest appearance in written records. Alfred the Great is credited with the development of the Fyrd system together with the building of burhs, the development of a cavalry force, and the building of a fleet. Each element of the system was meant to remedy defects in the West Saxon military establishment exposed by the Viking invasions. If under the existing system, he could not assemble forces quickly enough to intercept mobile Viking raiders, the obvious answer was to have a standing field force. If this entailed transforming the West Saxon Fyrd from a sporadic levy of king's men and the retinues into a mounted standing army, so be it. If his kingdom lacked strong points to impede the progress of an enemy army, he would build them. If the enemy struck from the sea, he would counter them with his own naval power. Characteristically, all of Alfred's innovations were firmly rooted in traditional West Saxon practice, drawing as they did on the three so-called common burdens of bridge work, fortress repair and service on the king's campaigns that all holders of bookland and royal loanland owed the crown. Where Alfred revealed his genius was in designing the field force and burghs to be parts of a coherent military system. Neither Alfred's reformed Fyrd nor his burghs alone would have afforded a sufficient defense against the Vikings. Together, however, they robbed the Vikings of the major strategic advantages: surprise and mobility. The Fyrd was used heavily by King Harold in 1066, for example in resisting invasion by Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy. The historian David Sturdy has cautioned about regarding the Fyrd as a precursor to a modern national army composed of all ranks of society, describing it as a ridiculous fantasy. The persistent old belief that peasants and small farmers gathered to form a national army or Fyrd is a strange delusion dreamt up by antiquarians in the late 18th or early 19th centuries to justify universal military conscription. Henry I of England, the Anglo-Norman king who promised at his coronation to restore the laws of Edward the Confessor and who married Scottish princess with West Saxon royal forebears, called up the Fyrd to supplement his feudal levies as an army of all England, as Orderic Vitalis reports, to counter the abortive invasions of his brother Robert Curthose both in the summer of 1101 and in autumn 1102.